Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Helen Allen. I'm the Executive Director of the Winter Show. We're delighted to welcome you here today at America's leading art, antiques, and design show. As many of you know, the Winter Show is not just a celebration of exceptional art and craftsmanship, it's also a benefit for Eastside House Settlement. Founded in 1891, Eastside House is a service organization based in the South Bronx that provides life-changing programs to support education, workforce development, and community well-being. All of you being here today helps actually help New Yorkers in need, and so for that, we're truly grateful for you being here. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's panel discussion, From Generation to Generation, How HIV/AIDS Changed the Design Community. The discussion will examine what it was like to be part of the design community at the height of the AIDS crisis. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Adam Eli.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to introduce our panelists quickly. Over here, we have Adam Charlap Hyman, who is an interior designer and partner at architecture and interiors firm Charlap Hyman Herrero, and a Young Collectors Night honoree here, and my fiance. We have Carlos Soto, who's an extraordinarily accomplished set designer, costume designer, and creative director. We have Charles Renfro, who really needs no introduction, but is an incredible architect and partner at Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, one of the most interesting architecture firms today, and has already made a huge impact on the built environment of our city. We have Wendy Goodman, one of the most prolific and influential journalists in the world of design, the design editor of New York Magazine, and as far as I can tell, the patron saint of this community. And we have Carl, who is an incredible interior designer and was a partner of the late Bernd Golliker, and a true icon of 10th Street. Before I start off, I want to give you a little bit of information about the images that I believe will appear in a rotating form. Some of these images we're going to be talking about directly, and others are emblematic interiors and architecture from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that come directly from the communities affected by HIV and AIDS. And so the idea for this panel came because my partner, Adam, and I have a shared interest in the history of New York and the way that queer people shape and are shaped by New York City. And as we all know, in this little corner of the world that we're occupying, the story of antiques, architecture, interior design, journalism, and collecting in New York City is also the story of queer people in New York City. And when we think about that story, there is a painful, sometimes dark, sometimes beautiful, and extremely important chapter that is sometimes omitted or not given its full due. And so I want to start with Adam. As a decorator and as half of an interior and architecture practice, working today, where does your interest in this subject lie?
My interest in this subject, I think, in part comes from just there being a lot of mystery around people and spaces that I'm very interested in from a research perspective, from the perspective of a designer just trying to learn about what has come before and seeing things that are very compelling and not being able to grasp the full story. And I think what has kind of become clear to me is that a lot of the story was captured by an oral tradition that has been broken, and it was not something that was written down. So when I'm interested to learn more about the life of Ward Bennett, let's say, and what made those spaces look the way they look, which is something very personal, and his own spaces, the spaces for Morella Agnelli, why was she interested in them? What was going on socially? What was going on politically? What was going on in the idea, the questioning around family, around domesticity that led to the creation of such radical spaces? You know, I can't get a lot of information about it because it's lost. And when I think about, well, where has it gone? You know, maybe it's gone away with the person who died. You know, maybe somebody died of AIDS and they took their story with them. Or maybe the person that knew the story died of AIDS. Or maybe we're just not talking about the story because it brings to mind painful things. But for whatever reason, and all kind of connected to this issue of HIV/AIDS and its impact on this community, I can't learn about the story of Ward Bennett and why those rooms look the way they look. And so that's kind of where it starts for me. And then just like a kind of side note is that there's the issue of trying to learn about people that were working at the time that this was such a big deal. But there's also the issue of trying to learn about people from before who, because their stories were not things that they would have written down because they were the stories of gay people who didn't write these things down. And they were stories that were passed between people verbally. It was an oral tradition, like I was saying. So, you know, if I want to learn about the story of Jean-Michel Franck, again, I think a lot of that story was carried by people that either died or are not talking. We're not all talking about it. And so I can't learn about him either. And so I guess the interest really comes for me from just wanting to learn about the history here and feeling like there's a wall a little bit. So, yeah.
Thank you, Adam. And Charles, I feel like you're a logical follow-up to that. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, and specifically and generally how this generation, this lost generation, has impacted you, your work, and your field.
From the point of view of being a resident, a part-time resident of Fire Island, and having been there for 12 years, I purchased a Horace Gifford house, which is on the screen here, and realizing that there's a kind of architectural depression, a design depression that sort of came over the island, and not just a cultural and social one, but a kind of design depression where the innovations that brought beach culture and domestic architecture together in such a beautiful, and gayness together in such a beautiful way in Fire Island, Pines, and Cherry Grove, and a couple other communities, sort of went into hibernation. You know, in fact, I don't think that there has been a piece of domestic architecture built on the island that lives up to the legacy of the ambitions of the 70s and early 80s on the island. And it's a kind of challenge to me and my architectural peers to kind of get out of our slumber and advance into the next generation of work. So I'm not speaking exactly to the lost generation, such as Horace Gifford, who died of AIDS, but simply just the impact it feels like it's had on innovation around being queer and around architecture of queerness, that feels missing.
Thank you, Charles. It's beautiful. Wendy, you were working in between fashion media and design media in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about that time and what conversations were and weren't being had both in the press and behind the scenes amongst editors and writers. And in what way do you feel like your field was permanently altered and has been permanently altered?
Well, yeah, I started my career in fashion, and I'm just going to give, before I give a very personal story that I think signifies what happened in the media, I'm going to give you a little tiny bullet point timeline. 1981, first reported cases of AIDS. Okay, think 1981. Nothing was being written about it. It was a very small item, I think, in the New York Times, wherever, if even an item. Then 1984, DIFA starts. Now, DIFA is the Design Industries Foundation Fighting AIDS. That is done by designers, by the industry, who are talking about it and drawing attention to it. ACT UP starts in 1987. Again, a very politicized, very loud, you can't avoid the demonstrations of ACT UP. Now, meanwhile, our President Reagan, back in the time, whose wife Nancy Reagan was best friends with William Haynes, Billy Haynes, who was an actor turned decorator who lived with his partner, could not bring his partner to the White House. And Nancy did not pressure her husband, the president, because it was 6.5 years into his presidency that he even spoke about AIDS. 1989, the Love Ball happens, raising $400,000. Again, these are queer, gay people, everybody in the creative arts, let's say. 1993, President Clinton established the White House National AIDS Policy. Okay, it started in 1981. Then, 1995, AIDS is the leading cause of death in America for all Americans between 25 and 44 ages. Anyway, my own story, I could go on and on with the, excuse me, the non-events of the media coverage. Because what was happening in the media, I was first in fashion. I noticed that my dear beloved friends and my professional colleagues were disappearing. They wouldn't come to a shoot. They were sick. Nobody told you why. You couldn't contact them. Then my dear friend, John Duca, who I met at New York Magazine in the 80s, he was living as a gay man with his partner, who's a fashion designer, Stephen Maniello. He was coming to work. He was inviting me to their parties. It was great. And then all of a sudden, John got a job at the New York Times. And everything changed. He started wearing suits. He didn't live with Stephen Maniello anymore. He didn't really talk about his gay life. He didn't admit to his gay life. And I asked him what was going on. He said, well, you know, at the Times, it's really better to be really buttoned up and professional, i.e. not be gay. So I thought this was really strange, but I thought, well, what do I know? He's, you know, John was like a god to me. He was a mentor. He was my best friend. And then he disappeared. And nobody told me what was going on. And I tried to find him, call him, visit him, couldn't do it. And John finally called me. Now, this is a little personal, but this just shows you how AIDS and homosexuality and the whole brew was about terror and about shame. And John finally called me and he said, Wendy, I have to tell you that you've got to wash your vegetables. I said, excuse me, what? And he said, I'm sick because I got an infection from vegetables. Anyway, that is part of the tragedy of us being in the dark, of us not being able to acknowledge the truth of what is happening. But the truth is that the industry and the media was not talking about it, was not helping in ways, because you can't keep things secret. You must tell the truth and you must be open to help. So that took a long time to happen, is really the short answer.
Thank you, Wendy, for sharing that. I think that was really beautiful. And something we talked a lot about in preparation for the panel is a series of pieces, Heroes by Doug Mayer. And we have some of those rotating. Could you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yes, I forgot about that. So Doug Meyer, an artist, an amazing talent. He was asked by the editor-in-chief, Pamela Giacarino, who was the editor-in-chief of Lux magazine, in 2014 to do an installation for a table, because there were these wonderful events. Designers would do tables, raise money. And so Doug did portraits of heroes. These were creatives who died of AIDS in all fields: writers, designers, interior designers. I think he created 14 of them originally, and then he did a book, and there are 50 heroes. You can buy his book, Heroes. And he was the first one to really go publicly, as I can remember, because I remember going into his installation, and it was like a museum show, and he did these beautiful portraits of people that a lot of the people may not have known who were at the show. There was John Duca, Suga, who is this incredible, most famous hairdresser in the world. I mean, it went on and on. So that hero show was a very big kind of, I would say, moment of celebration of the people we lost.
So we heard from Wendy about what it was like working in journalism, and this week I had the pleasure of spending a bunch of time with Carl, who has some amazing stories. And so, Carl, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about what it was like to be gay and in New York in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and a part of the queer community.
I guess because I'm the oldest at the table here. I am a New Yorker. I was born down in Chinatown. I was born in the projects. The 70s was an incredible period of transition for our culture, for all fields, for art, for dance, for music. Everything was happening. Everything was changing. The pill. I was an architect then, closeted completely, working in an openly homophobic famous architectural firm. And I was suicidal. I was completely lost and unsatisfied with my work, and the atmosphere of the partners was paralyzing to me. Something happened at the Museum of Modern Art that changed my life, which was the Emilio Ambaz, the new domestic landscape, which brought in European Satsas, Gaolenti, all of the Italian designers were represented in this extraordinary event, which started to change an aesthetic. You had the architects in America like Richard Meyer doing spare white minimalism, and here you had color and materials that you've never seen before, and it changed everything. I went to work for one of my teachers, Alan Buxbaum, and Alan was the first architect doing lofts in Soho, and he had the most extraordinary clientele. Like, we were doing Bette Midler, we were doing Anna Wintour. Anna still works at the desk in Vogue that he designed for her. And I was designing inflatable furniture for Ellen, drawing blueprints for blow-ups. It was a period of uptown meets downtown at Studio 54. If you had money, you ate at Mr. Chow's, otherwise you ate in the East Village at the 24-hour restaurant. The people you met, the people you worked with. I was best friends with an art critic named Douglas Crimp, who was the editor of October magazine for 15 years. And we would go to every gallery. It was a petri dish. People came from all over to be here. You had pop art just happening. You had Warhol happening. It was vibrant and exciting. I was still very, very closeted. But I met wonderful people like Joe D'Urso, whose work for Larry Kramer. The aesthetic was changing. The aesthetic was opening up from architects who only thought interior designers did throw pillows and negating the great history that designers have. I mean, a great designer should be able to do a garden and a dinner in addition to designing a chair and whatever. It was a revelation to me. I was in the transition that the period was in the transition of. I lived next door to a lesbian bar, and I would watch Candy Darling leave in the morning. And I thought, I'm in the heart of everything, and you could see Bob Dylan living around the corner. Everything was happening. I went to what Charles was talking, Fire Island, which was the first time I ever saw men with men before. I had never been in a gay bar. I was completely naive. And the friendships that we met there and the people who disappeared because of the tragedies that we've all talked about, it was a heartbreaking time once things started to change. It was, I don't know why I'm even here anymore, how it happened. At the time, I was living with a partner who was a online producer for 2020 and 60 Minutes, and Joe Lovett at the time, and he was the first one to produce a gay-oriented documentary for 2020 for National Broadcast Television. That was monumental. That was a big deal.
Thank you so much, Carl. We had a great time this week. Okay, now I want to go to Carlos Soto. I was with a beloved friend who's here today, Camille Okio. Hi, Camille. And we were talking about this panel, and we were at the Alvin Ailey show at the Whitney, which is extraordinary. And she recommended that you be part of the panel as a collector. And I know that in your collection, there are certain pieces that pertain to HIV and AIDS. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about those pieces and how you believe that some of those pieces, their stories are lost to history. You've been able to figure some stuff out, but not all of it.
I think I wanted to circle back to something that Adam said earlier, and I think that also a lot of the families end up covering or maybe keeping a lot of those stories also to themselves. You know, I was born in 1980, so I'm part of that like really weird generation of people. I'm probably still dealing with all the complexes that, you know, and had a very providential mentor in the artist Robert Wilson at the time when he was finally gaining control of the estate of Paul Thek, who died of AIDS in the late 80s, and trying to figure out some things about the estate of, I can't remember his name now, Jack Smith. Both of these people whose families wanted nothing to do with them until they died, and then suddenly wanted all of their possessions. Thek left Wilson his estate, and it went to trial, and it stayed in Wilson's hands only by Susan Sontag's testimony that the best decision Paul Thek could have made was to give his estate to Robert Wilson, because Robert Wilson is such a bad business person. There's no way he would have sold it for profit. Wilson was also my mentor as a collector. I think I'm part of that neurotype of people that accumulate things of similar type for whatever reason that is. I still don't know. But collecting art came very early and probably very naively, and it was artwork made by friends. And at some point in the late 90s, Wilson and I photographed Nan Golden, and she gave me a photograph of Cookie Mueller in her casket. And that wasn't my first artwork, but it was the first artwork, I think, that made me question why one would collect something. It's funny being here as a collector, because I don't collect in the way that most people collect. I am a working artist, meaning I'm not a millionaire. And a lot of things that I collect are memories of objects that get away. But that piece, I traveled with it. I moved to Berlin in 2020 when I was 20 and carried it with me unframed. I finally framed it a few years ago. But it started this idea that in a way we're all stewards of the things that we possess. Whether we want to treasure them or not, we own a lot of things. And I think the first work I ever collected purposefully that I chased and hunted down, I purchased right after Donald Trump became president in 2016. And that was a self-portrait by the photographer Pierre Molinier, far before the AIDS crisis happened, but another artist whose story we might never know. He never left anything. His family certainly doesn't want to do anything. His daughter sold everything off. But I managed to take this one piece because I thought, if I don't take it now, where will all these things end up? You know, as if I'm some kind of major archive keeping things. But slowly I started to accumulate things, and then did a show about Robert Mapplethorpe, who I hadn't thought about in maybe 2 decades. It was an opera production by composer Bryce Dessner. And I think the concept started off to pick 5 images, and I ended up curating a selection of about 350 images, all taken from the estate, telling the story of Mapplethorpe's life through the 3 portfolios, but dealing with, you know, the role of sex, black men and flowers in his life, et cetera, et cetera. A really boring show that nobody ever has to revisit. But there was this beautiful image, and it has a very funny story that I won't tell right now because it's long and complicated, but it's more or less the last image that Mapplethorpe took of a sexually explicit act. And it kind of soured him to that body of work, and then he moved to black men and flowers. Many of those men are dead. We don't know their names. He didn't really keep model contracts, didn't really pay people either. That's kind of up to us as stewards to rewrite the story, or to at least identify who's in the image, you know?
Yeah, and those artists that you were talking about, Hujar and Mapplethorpe, those are people whose work were preserved, that had people writing about them at the time, who people were, less Hujar, but people were collecting them at the time. And so I know you and I were talking about what about the artists that weren't? And for example, especially we're talking about Larry Stanton, whose work we found by mistake. Maybe you'll tell us that's...
The person who actually should be in my seat is this guy named Fabio Certic, who writes a lot for Apartamento and has an incredible personal collection of works by Patrick Angus, who is a painter that specialized in his genre were the bathhouses and the movie theaters in Times Square. In the process of putting together Patrick's estate, together with another curator, he happened upon the work of a artist from the same generation, a very similar hand, but very poignant style, named Larry Stanton. And Larry was a compulsive drawer of portraits, and he would sleep with men and draw their portrait. Most of these don't have names on them. They're very beautiful. I mean, they all kind of look the same. They're all kind of beautiful blonde boys with curly hair and stylized, but they're people who will never know who they are. We're lucky that some of them have names, and there's some beautiful anecdotes in the catalog that Apartamento published with some people who either Larry had a relationship with or some kind of biography is able to be put back together.
Thank you, Carlos. As Wendy touched on, there's been so much discussion about HIV and AIDS in fashion, in the fashion community. There was, at the time and now, there's books and movies and TV shows and talks. Vogue just did a great series of articles. But somehow, as we've talked about, you feel like there's maybe a little less in the design world. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, it's just conjecture and sort of from personal observation. So, I can't say definitively, but I feel that there is something about the design community, the interior designers, architects. It is a service industry, and it is in service of people that are generally, in a generalized way, more conservative. People that can afford these services are generally quite safe and want to feel safe and want their interiors and their houses to make them feel safe. Something about that, it seems to me, is at the heart of why the fashion community can sort of delve into this in so many different ways and actually kind of pick up where they left off to some extent, that they can integrate what has happened in an intellectual way, in a rigorous way, and continue to make interesting, thought-provoking, question-asking designs. And maybe why in the world of interiors, at least, or, Charles, as you say, that on Fire Island, there has been sort of a truncation of a sort of whole train of thought that was so amazing, so radical, that maybe this is kind of why that hasn't continued, that it's been truncated, that we've left it and we haven't been able to really revisit it, is because in this corner of the world, we are kind of in the service of a more conservative group of people, perhaps. We might be far enough away from sort of the hardest, most horrific part of this story, to be able to get into this in a new way, and to revisit this, and to hopefully capture some of the things that might be lost if we don't start talking about them right now and don't start asking tons of questions right now. But I'm always struck by yes, this kind of extraordinary, thoughtful, philosophical interior design dialogue. I'm more interior designer than architect, but Charles, you could speak to it on an architectural front. But in the interior design world, I mean, there was just such crazy stuff happening in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, people were really reevaluating everything about what a home could mean in such a cool way. And when you look at how things started to appear in design magazines in the 90s, it's very different. This dialogue kind of ended, and it has not really been picked up, a really questioning, serious, intellectual dialogue around interior design, let's say. So that was kind of, yeah,
And just a little observation just occurred to me that there was either a coincidence or something that egged something else on. And so in the 80s, in architecture, and I think in design too, there was a shift to postmodernism. And it feels like that shift away from, real interrogation about essences and to kind of go back into the world of pastiche sort of allowed us to cover up the real hard-hitting questions of what was happening. And I feel like you said that the 90s we kind of lost it, I think about the club culture in the 80s. It's like the discos of New York were just incredible. And then in the 90s, in reaction to AIDS, we sort of huddled and went underground. We went to Nell's, we went to MK, we went to these clubs that felt old-fashioned, and they felt like they were retrenchments. And so it just feels like, whether we spoke about it or not, it feels like we were kicked backwards, into another era in various ways. And one thing I'll just end with, and I'll let other people speak, is, one of the things that we're concerned about on Fire Island is people don't understand how devastating the plague was there. Like half of the population, maybe more, I don't know what the statistics are, but really considerable number of people died. And now with the advent of Truvada and Viagra and all the party drugs that make people come to Fire Island and sort of treat it like it was treated in the 70s, which is fantastic, but without knowing there was this really horrific moment of 15, 20 years where half the island was decimated, and all the designers and of various sorts, creatives of various sorts, were lost. So with the AIDS Memorial, we are trying to, first of all, I'm trying to do it without it being a visual, kind of to look like something else. It's really about going to this place and experiencing the island and experiencing where these people were laid to rest, which is the ocean. And so it looks like nothing. It looks like, hopefully you'll look at it and think, what the hell is this? And we're trying to get young people to experience things in a much more broad way and not lecture at them, but to actually understand how meaningful that island was for people to reinvent the way they were making their creative work. And they did it by being in nature, being with each other. I wrote an essay for Chris Rollins' book, and I said that when gay men went to Fire Island, they were renaturalized. And the design that blended nature and lifestyle made people feel like they were actually part of nature again. And it was really a wonderful thing. I'm trying to do that with the design of the AIDS Memorial, get people back into nature.
Thank you. That was, what a dream answer. Okay, Carl, we've been talking a lot about intergenerational moments and communications that were missed. And when you and I were spending time together this week, you told me an amazing story that prompted this question, which is, what advice were you given as a young decorator? And what advice would you give to young decorators?
As a young designer at that time, and I would translate this to today to young people who are just starting out, go to your friends' offices, go look at the work after hours, let them show you their projects that they're working on, go to Charles's office. We all know people working in firms, and it's one way to learn something. It's one way to really get your hands on something. If you're a junior and you're not seeing something, you're getting to see major projects after hours, touching the materials, seeing the drawings. It's a really important aspect of design. Read. Go to libraries and read magazines. Read European magazines. But the story you want me to tell is about when I transitioned from architecture into interior design. A very well-known decorator who was retiring said, you're going to make 3 mistakes. You're going to make the same 3 mistakes. And one is, it's a business. I had no idea how to charge anyone anything, and you learn the hard way. 2, they're not your friends. And yes, I've done 11 homes for one family, 9 for another, and they are part of your life over 20 years. But there is a division. There They are not your friends. You feel that they are, and you know that you would do anything for them. And the last question, the last item changed my life when I got married to my partner, the late antique dealer Bernd Bittler, which is you can have a private life. I mean, all these years of showing up for events, of black tie and dinners, and I value my time and my downtime tremendously. It's really important. I want to pick something up that Charles was just about to go on to, or I feel that what is lacking is the community has not come together again in the way it did in the 80s and 90s when we started ACT UP, when we started DIFA, when we started GMHC. You know, GMHC would have these extraordinary events. We rented Madison Square Garden for the circus, the entire community. Fashion came into it. You know, it was, the community was, all the communities were coming together. There was power in it. ACT UP was extremely instrumental in changing drug regulation and changing the way drugs were reviewed. You know, you had someone like Larry or Alvin Friedman Keene. You had these people who started these events, fought, left them, and started another thing. God's love, we deliver. It's still in existence. It's still wonderful. But I don't feel that there's a cohesive coming together these days. I think that's what's missing in many ways.
Thank you, Carl. And before I turn it over to questions, I just want to make sure for our panelists, is there anything else that on your mind, anything left unsaid?
There's a few images on here of Larry Kramer's apartment on Washington Square Park, and it was designed by Joe Durso, and I think it's just a really clear illustration of the essence of what we're talking about, which is that it's sort of one and the same, the queer community, interior design, the philosophy of what a home can be, architecture, collecting, activism, the whole thing, you know, it was one thing. And Larry Kramer had this amazing radical apartment that was designed by Joe Durso.
You know, Joe is coming out of Ward Bennett, you know, the influence of that material, that aesthetic being passed on and refined by him. I think, which is what you're talking about a lost generation of transmission of material and history in some way.
Forgive me, I'm 75 years old. I came here when I was 18. I came out when I was 23, so everybody that you're talking about, just about, I knew and knew well. And I'm so glad, Carlo, that you mentioned Bob Curry, who was a genius. Not to make it about me, but he commissioned me to make jewelry for the windows of Bergdorf's that was never worn and never sold. And it was for a company that was so fashion forward that they weren't even showing their product in videos that Richard Avedon made. There was a jewelry designer called Philip Zoine, and he would have been one of the great jewelry designers if he had lived. I'm just going to, Wendy, make a personal story. I went to visit him in the hospital, and I hugged him. And he looked at me, and he said, "You have no idea what this means to me. No one has hugged me." And the way that I noticed people disappearing was when they started showing up, and I realized they were wearing heavy pancake makeup to cover the Kaposi's sarcomas. So forgive me for not asking a question, but...
My question is for Carl, Wendy, and Charles. What did you guys do with the loss? How did the tremendous loss that you experienced in this era impact your work and your personal lives and your health?
Well, therapy. You know, it's tremendous. Survivor's guilt and therapy. You know, Alan Buxbaum died. He was the first I knew. I knew Philip. I dated Philip, who you mentioned. And Philip was Michael Kors' best friend. I knew them when they just graduated FIT. My then business partner became positive just as we were incorporating, and he and his husband died. It was, you know, people, you could not open the New York Times without seeing two people you knew who died every day, one a day. The obituaries were staggering. The insurance companies would drop you if you had 10014 zip codes. You couldn't get insurance. It was what was going on then could reoccur now under this new administration, this callousness that's going on. We all have to be very careful. But how you deal with tremendous loss, we have to remember, we can never forget. We will never forget these people. We can never forget the impact they had on our lives, on our aesthetics. I mean, you brought up Jean-Michel Frand. Jean-Michel Frand was one of the best designers in the world. He committed suicide. He jumped out of a window. He jumped off a roof or a window. I don't remember. These were great people, and there's so many missing great people. How do you deal with loss? How do you deal being a widower? I'm a widower now. You know, how does one get out of bed and find meaning to wake up and take a shower and go out there again? It's really hard. I don't know. Work though was a great salvation to me. Throwing yourself into work was a lifesaver. Reinventing those things. You got to play out everything. I had never been in a Park Avenue apartment in my life until I had to design my first one. It was like, you really are in the land of self-invention. I had an education, but my education was in architecture. I regret that I didn't go to Parsons and have the decorating background. I'm fortunate that I had the experience and the self-knowledge. My husband was one of the best antique dealers in America, as far as I'm concerned, and he opened my eyes to furniture in a way that nothing else will. But work was a salvation. Work was something, as was ACT UP. It was a great place to be. You met so many people from so many walks of life, and everyone was giving an aspect of their professionalism however they could. I was on the grant committee for DIFA, which was the Design Industry Foundation for AIDS before it was transitioned by the fashion by GMH. But I think we went to see startups all over the state, giving grant seed money to young organizations that are now still in existence and thriving and very helpful. So yes, the idea of some charity work, some volunteer work, your own work, that helped me get out of bed every day.
Well, I'll just say still bereft, losing best friends and losing the most treasured talents. But I think that, we are alive, and our responsibility is to keep them alive, their work alive, and also to be very conscious that we don't slip backwards, as we are facing one of the most terrifying times in this country's history. So we all have a responsibility to keep our eyes open, to not be complicit in any way to all the things we've been discussing today, that this could happen again, because we're in trouble. So I just think we have to honor the people we've lost, love them the way we love them, and really carry on with honesty.
Maybe it's a time to found a political action group among our designers. That there is a lot of tiredness, laziness, and just complicity, I guess, in a way. What I was going to just say simply, we don't know what we don't know, and I think there's probably a generation of design work that we're just missing. Of kind of innovation that we saw in the 80s. 70s and 80s by gay men and for gay men that just sort of went away, and we just don't know what's missing. And I guess we need to think about how to step in and perhaps make the stuff that was missing, or just take the spirit that was happening and that got stripped and push it into the next generation of work.
I'm curious about the role of institutions and museums and Kunsthalles, and how you see that archival work and the communication around the stories of many of these designers being honored in positive ways. Are museums doing enough? Is this a question for publications? Are there resources that you can share with everyone?
I mean, I just went to the Met to see the Paul Rudolph drawings, which are exquisite. Please go to see them. But here we have a closeted gay architect who at 38 years old was the dean of Yale School of Architecture. He wasn't even 40 yet. He had his students then were James Sterling, Richard Rogers, Norman Foster. He was unbelievable at the time, and then his whole practice fell apart. At a certain point, fell out of favor, I think. But the point of which is, when he was working, I was in, as I said earlier, in an openly homophobic environment, a really unfriendly architectural office, a major office, major names. And here was a man like that who could not say who he was. Today, it's an honor to be able to say who you are. My office, no one could ever say anything negative about a gay experience in my office or in your office. It's so refreshing and liberating to have that out in the open, to be who we are, to acknowledge who we are. It's a different world. It's an unbelievable experience. And yes, I was angry at the Met for, I think that's a side of his life. The homes that he designed, what's now called the Halston home, which is really the Hearst townhouse, it was not designed for Halston. And I think the Met was really remiss in not delving into that story. And his own Beekman Place townhouse, these were not homes designed for children. These were homes designed for his single men or gay men, or at that time, his clients were at that time, and they were unique environments for that specific type of person. Rather interesting. And I think that's not been delved into at all. I think that's.
All right, everyone. Thank you so, so much. And a big, big thank you to our panelists. I know this was emotional and I just appreciate you doing it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.